Welcome to the Champion Group's Top 3 Mistakes Leaders Make in School Fundraising. Here is our founder and your host, Mr. Don Carmichael.
The top 3 mistakes leaders make in school fundraising. I would say that this is true whether you're a Christian school, a non-faith-based private school, and even public schools. These are trends and dynamics that we see really across the school platforms. So the top 3 mistakes leaders make. The first place I'd like to start is introducing you to my family. And the reason I want to do this is everything about fundraising, in terms of effective fundraising, is relationship-based. Everything we do through our company here is all relationship-based. And so the reason I want you to see this is that this is my family. My wife, Vicki, behind me, during our 27-year marriage, throughout our marriage, she's been a Christian school teacher or administrator. And all 4 of our children are products of Christian education. And it's our opinion in our family, and I would say really our company as well. We believe a Christian education is the single greatest gift and investment that we can make in the lives of our children. So I just want you to know that probably for most or all of us on this webinar, that we share a lot of the philosophical fundamentals in terms of the why behind what we're talking about today. And I think it's real important to be reminded that money is an essential tool for mission. And the more money you have, the more mission options you have to accomplish your mission at a higher level. So in terms of very brief introduction, I just want to set up the webinar with, if you will, some credentials and perspective, and then get into some teaching points. So we're very much, at the Champion Group, a mission-focused company. We're a small company. We have about 13 employees in the U.S., and we have 5 to 6 team members in Canada. We bring the results at this point from over 2,600 major fundraising events that have been conducted in 48 states, plus coast to coast in Canada. And at this point, a little bit over $100 million has been raised. And yes, Dina, that's in US dollars, not Canadian dollars, just for what it's worth. But we've seen a lot of things in our years of working with hundreds and hundreds of schools. We have a quirky industry, but we are considered best in class in this industry. And the bottom line is we're in it because of the mission. We want to have a legacy mission impact in the lives of students, as well as people and young people throughout the country. So that's why we do what we do. In terms of sort of how we help schools, our niche, if you will, is doing major fundraising events that energize families, bring them together into an actual fundraising campaign, where they bring a lot of money in through friends and family networks, corporate sponsors, underwriters, church engagement where applicable, alumni engagement, but bringing all of these categories into play through the energy of a major fundraising event that fits the culture and some of the objectives of a particular school. But some of the specific reasons that we partner with schools is, number one, to fund tuition gaps. Most private schools, and certainly most Christian schools, operate with a gap between their tuition revenue and their operating budget. And a lot of times there's a lot of pressure on administrators on how in the world are we going to be able to fund this gap. And I'd say that's where a very significant number of our schoolwork comes into is tuition gap funding. Second category would be funding special project needs. And these typically fall into areas such as technology, funding technology enhancements, facility enhancements, teacher raises and bonuses, scholarships, and I'd say playground, library books, but pretty much those are the 4 general areas that we tend to focus on. A couple of other things, bullet points in terms of how we help schools, is that most of the events we do, we see raising anywhere from generally about 300 to 500 first-time donors for the smaller schools. Some of the larger schools, those that have 700 or 800, maybe 1,000 students, often they're getting up into 2,000 to 3,000 first-time donor connection through this process. And I'd say the final reason that we are typically partnered with schools is to help them eliminate most or all of their small fundraisers. But that's enough about us. I'd like to shift into some other things related to our topic. And so let me just pose this question. And I realize Edna has you on mute, so you all probably aren't going to be able to answer out loud. But what percentage of your school families truly love fundraising? And Edna, I know we didn't set up on this call, but I bet you know the answer. What is the answer?
Well, besides me, because I'm weird, the answer is usually 0.
That's right. We say 0% because very few people we've met absolutely love fundraising. So whenever you're talking about fundraising within your school, you're talking about how can you do something that's needed in an environment that people really don't want to do. It's like going to the dentist. You have to do it. So there's some ways you can overcome that and make it fun and appealing. We'll get into those ideas in a few minutes. Second question I'd like you to consider is, on a scale of 1 to 10 in your school, how excellent would you rate your school's fundraising success and methods? So scale of 1 to 10, you don't need to share that with us, but this is just sort of for a quick personal gauge on how well and how effectively you feel like you're raising money within your school. So the outline over the rest of this webinar is going to focus on these 3 areas. Initially, very quick perspectives in understanding why people give. I think that's very important, because if you understand the why people give, then you can tailor fundraising approaches to be more effective towards those already built-in motivations. Second area, we're going to talk about the top 3 fundraising mistakes that schools make. And these 3 mistakes, and there's subcategories under some of these, but number 1, schools do too many fundraisers in a year. Number 2, schools do the wrong fundraisers that don't yield very much and often cause volunteer burnout, which is a very serious issue. And number 3, no master plan. So we find that the vast majority of schools, especially your Christian schools and private schools that are tuition-based, we find the vast majority are actually stuck in an ongoing 12-month cycle of survival, and that cycle repeats year after year after year. So we'll talk about these 3 problems and give you some insights on them, and then also recommended solutions. So I'd like to start here. This is a small school in Birmingham, Alabama, where we're headquartered. It's called Spring Valley. The entire school has 63 students in it. They'd never raised more than $40,000, which is pretty good for a school of that size. And they were trying to overcome some dynamics that they had had in the past of A, doing too many fundraisers, B, doing low yield fundraisers, and C, having no plan, the big 3 problems we talked about. And this is probably the most extraordinary example that we've seen. So this is not typical, but we took this little school through some information that we're sharing with you on this webinar and helped them tailor a different approach in fundraising. And they went from their best historical fundraiser of $40,000 to actually $154,000 gross, about $105,000 net. And they were able to take parents that in some cases were very adamant and almost adversarial when it came to fundraising, and actually get their buy-in and engagement. And so we saw a lot of soft benefits from this event, way beyond just the money and the new donors. We saw a re-energized family base. We saw families taking greater stakeholder relationships in their school. And that's one of the reasons that I think if you can look at your fundraising processes and look at how you can enhance them, that some of the long-term objectives are not, the short-term objectives would be money and in maybe better ways of doing things, more efficiency, more volunteer enthusiasm. Long-term, you're looking at hopefully changing the culture of your school to where your parents are more stakeholders and they're more engaged, not just in fundraising, but in a variety of other areas that are related to schools. So, fundraising perspectives. Number 1, I mentioned this earlier, money is an essential tool for mission. If you have more money, you have more options to accomplish your mission at a higher level. And the end result of that, and what motivates us, is that people's lives are impacted at a higher level. So we believe money is a tool that directly can impact people. And that's really what excites us. Number 2, true fundraising is heart-driven. It's important that you have incentives. It's important that you do things that are fun with contests and maybe classroom competitions. Those things are all valid and they do have an important role. But you can only get so far in fundraising if that's how you're driving it. True fundraising has to be driven from the heart, and it has to be at a deeper level with your parents, understanding the why that your school needs money and the privilege they have, the opportunity to be part of funding something that's very significant, not just for their own kids, but for other kids. So true fundraising is an outflow of the heart, and it's really important that in all of your messaging and how you position your fundraisers, that you're connecting that heart at the beginning, creating the why. Okay, number three, this is actually the most important principle in fundraising. It really is. And that is that people give to people they know. The relationship is actually far more important between a donor and the person asking in most cases than the cause is. So people give to people based on relationship. So anything you're doing from a fundraising standpoint, even if you're doing product sales, if you're doing mattress sales, if you're doing, I mean, name it, car washes, bake sales, the reason most people buy overpriced products, or the reason most people get involved in something like a bake sale, is there's a relationship and they're wanting to help the people out. It's not so much the benefit of what they're getting. Now, how much people give from the donor perspective, donors are going to give because of relationship. How much they give is influenced by their heart. So if you can find fundraising methods that involve your students in things that are more meaningful, activities that are focused on serving other people, for example, then you'll find that donors will tend to support that at a higher level. They're giving anyway because of the relationship, but they're giving more because their hearts are connected with what that student's doing. You've got to make it fun. Going back to nobody wants to really fundraise, nobody's truly excited about it. How do you get people to go to the dentist? Well, you've got to make it fun. So make sure that there's fun contests, that as much as you can in messaging, in assemblies, make it fun for your participants. But at a deeper level, make it meaningful. Again, if you can lead from the why, so your parents aren't just participating so their child can get a $3 Oriental Express.
Oriental Trader, yeah.
Oriental Trader Squishy Frog. But if they can actually, they're doing this because they actually have a heart to help your school, then everything changes. You just see a major shift. So this would be, I'd say, the platform. We're talking about perspectives that we think are important that also are very key as you tailor your own fundraising. All right, fundraising mistake number one, too many fundraisers. I want to introduce you all to St. James School. This is a school here in Alabama. It's in Montgomery, near where we are. And I was meeting with their development director. It's a larger school. They had, at the time that I met with her, about 900 to 1,000 students. So larger than many Christian schools. But so I was talking to her and I asked her the question, how many fundraisers does your school do throughout the course of a given year? And she said, well, we do 3 or 4. And then she sat back and she started thinking. She said, well, I think we do more than that. She said, let me get back to you. So she calls me 2 days later and she said, you will not believe what I found. She said, I went back and started looking at all the fundraisers we do, whether it's cheerleaders, baseball team, debate, band, and as well as school-wide. She said, we did 83 fundraisers last year.
What?
And it stunned her. She didn't even know. So one of the big mistakes that schools make, sometimes intentionally, because they're desperate. How are we going to cover this need? And you just keep doing more and more. Or by default, because you really don't realize how much everybody else is doing in school. One of the biggest mistakes schools make is too many fundraisers. And why is that? I think 3 reasons. One, there's a lack of knowledge of best practices. And that's one of Edna's and my goal today, is to really give you some best practice knowledge. Number 2, there's a lack of knowledge of better options. So you tend to just go with what you know or what's been done, and you sort of replicate that year after year result. And it's another reason that you are stuck in that year-to-year 12-month cycle of survival. And then there's another reason that we see, and these are not exclusive. A lot of times all 3 of these can be at play. But for schools that start to get a little bit larger in enrollment sizes, usually from 300 students and larger, we start to see and have seen a lot of internal competition for funds. Especially if your school has a separate athletic program that has its own budget that it's trying to raise, or your PTO or PTF organization has its own budget they're trying to raise. All of a sudden, you'll find that athletics has its own regimen of fundraisers, PTO has its own regimen, general fund has its own regimen. And yes, you may be coordinating that. You might have somebody that's a development director or the head of school is coordinating who does what. But before you know it, not only is your calendar filling up with fundraisers, now you have internal competition that is either subtle, sometimes it's overt, most of the times it's not, but that competition often leads to division and conflict. And, these are my donors or these are my parents for athletics, and I don't want you going to them for general fund or vice versa. So you see these three areas tend to be why schools often will do too many fundraisers. Now, let me give you a great principle that we use. And I'm not going to tell you the story. There's an absolutely amazing story behind this picture. But I want to just point out this picture. This is Navy SEALs training. And there's an acronym, and you're probably all familiar with it. And for many years, I thought it was one of the corniest acronyms I knew, so I never used it until I found out the Navy SEALs train on this acronym as sort of foundational for their training. But it's the acronym TEAM, TEAM, together, everyone achieves more. And so if your school is doing multiple fundraisers, and especially if you have internal departments, athletics, PTO, maybe even others, band, general fund, that are all doing their own fundraisers, one of the best things you can do is to get away from that and unify everybody behind one or two major fundraisers a year. The best practice is 2 major fundraisers a year. If you do a good job on those, you don't need to do anything else. Even the smaller team sports can be benefiting from these 2, and then therefore don't have to do their own deals. So there's a megatrend, school fundraising megatrend, that started probably 12 to 15 years ago. And we've seen this really help tremendous numbers of schools. So this first mistake, that doing too many, we're finding fewer and fewer schools are doing that mistake. But it was a trend of consolidation where schools, again, public schools, private schools, Christian schools, across the board began to get away from all these multiple nickel and dime fundraisers to consolidating into several larger fundraisers. And within that process, you're able to bring, especially if you split the pie up a little bit, you're able to bring a lot more beneficiaries into the process so that everybody feels like they're benefiting from it. And one of the things that, from a solution standpoint, in terms of dealing with the too many fundraiser issue, is number one, consolidate your quantity into a few quality. So go from, if you will, low yield quantity of fundraisers to a few high yield or high dollar fundraising events or campaigns. Number two, the best practice in terms of quantity of fundraisers is no more than 2 a year, typically fall, typically late winter, early spring. You want to avoid late spring because you're getting into spring fatigue, teacher burnout, parent burnout, and whatever your oldest grade is. So 8th grade if you're K through 8, or 12th grade, the farther you get into the spring, the more of that class you're going to lose. They're rolling out and moving on, so why should they fundraise? And then most importantly, within this, unite all of your parties by sharing the pie. So what does that mean? This is an example of one of the things that we recommend a lot. If you have the option, or you have the luxury of having an event that can raise $50,000 or $100,000, now you split the pie up. And so this is a very common split that we see schools doing. Even if their total need is tuition gap, to meet their budget, you still want to take a portion of what you raise and allocate it to at least 3 other areas that would be specific targets that are somewhat tangible that parents get excited about. Because I can tell you, the 3 different areas you can raise money for, debt is the absolute worst. Nobody wants to raise money for debt. Second, operating funds. Really, how can you get excited raising money for your budget? Okay, that just doesn't inspire people. But what does inspire people is raising money for opportunities to enhance your program, your technology. So what we recommend is that you take your total funds raised, this is after expenses, and maybe 70% goes towards the general fund if that's where your greatest need is. But have 3 different allocations of 10% each. One might go towards athletics, one could go towards technology, one towards teacher bonuses, towards scholarships, towards school bus, playground. But identify those 3 areas that your parents get most excited about and let them know. You don't have to let them know what the splits are unless they ask, but just let them know that the money we raise are going to be going towards our general operating needs along with athletics, technology, bonuses. And even though your parent might be most excited about the technology aspect, they're going to raise more money because of that than if 100% went towards just your general fund.
All right, but Don, can I jump in here real fast?
Yeah, you bet.
All right, so because my kids go to a small school, and I'm thinking, I can just imagine my daughter who's a cheerleader who does bake sales and, all those kind of fun car washes. And I don't know that the cheerleading coach would be like super thrilled about putting their money in here. I would think there'd be natural competition between, at least I've seen that, natural competition between these different, especially in athletics.
Yes.
So have you actually seen this like really work out in real world? Because I just think they all kind of like to do their own thing. And how do you really get them to all come together and agree to do one thing?
Well, let me say, I think a lot of these questions, and these are the right questions to ask, I don't think they're necessarily right or wrong answers to them. For example, I do think that product sales have a role to play in some of your small team fundraising. So it doesn't have to be a rigid either all or none. But what I've seen, for example, we worked with a school called Worthington Christian School in Worthington, Ohio, sort of the Columbus, Ohio area. And I don't think they'd ever raised more than $100,000 before. And we were looking at how can we engage as many families as possible, because they were a larger school. I think they may have had 800 students, 700 or 800. But what we talked about this principle and how 60% or 70% of the pie will be a whole lot more if you split it up in some other areas than 100% of the pie that's just going towards budget. And so they actually did something that I would say is a little bit more extreme than most schools. They identified 13 specific areas in their school that were budget needed areas. So they had everything from debate to transportation technology, classroom budgets, teacher bonuses, scholarships, athletics, cheerleading, band. And so they basically had the parents just choose their top 3 out of that 13 list, actually top 4. And so in their event, 60% went towards general fund, and they had 4 10% allocations. And every parent knew that their 4 areas of most interest were going to be benefited from the process. They did some internal negotiation with their athletic director, their coaches, and their other heads, and said, if you'll get behind this, let's see how well it works. And if it works, you'll raise as much money or more than trying to do your deals separately. They ended up raising $204,000 on that event. And they had very, very high engagement from their families because everybody felt like their pet project was getting benefited. So that's a great question. And that's just a really good example of how splitting the pie is together, everybody achieves more, going back to the Navy SEAL lesson. Okay, so mistake number 1 is doing too many fundraisers. Mistake number 2 is doing low yield fundraisers that often can cause or lead to volunteer burnout. And those really go sort of hand in hand. A lot of times if you're doing low yield fundraisers, you tend to do too many because you're trying to raise what you need to raise. So a couple of questions to those of you that are watching this. Number 1 is, does your school do too many fundraisers? Number 2, are most of your fundraisers in that $3,000 to $5,000 category? Or are you doing fundraisers that are raising $30,000 to $50,000 categories? And those would just be some things I would say that you should consider. And so when you think about low yield fundraisers, Edna, I might throw this at you. What are some examples of low yield fundraisers that you see with schools that you worked with?
Well, it's funny. I was just thinking when you're throwing out those numbers, I'm like, let's see, the last candy bar sale that I was involved in, I think we did $3,000. And it took seemed like 100 man hours at least. It didn't raise very much money. Let's see what my kids have done. They have definitely done the wrapping paper. Oh, just last week I got a call from a cheerleader, and I bought $25 worth of peanut butter balls, which came to a whole 12 peanut butter balls. I'm like, I would have rather just give them $25. Really?
Congratulations. I didn't realize that. That's funny.
They were low calorie. There wasn't very many.
Yeah.
So I see that. I see a lot of the car washes. The Chick-fil-A fundraisers tend to be big around here.
Okay.
Probably because we don't have a Chick-fil-A, so we all crave it. But, you go through Chick-fil-A, you pay $6. I think the school gets 2 of that. It's not even a 50-50 split. Those are some things I've seen around this area of the country.
So some of the things that I've seen over the years, barbecue sales, car washes, bake sales, lollipop sales. If you go to the Christian school conferences,
Oh, yeah.
you almost always have the lollipop guy there. You have candle sales, oranges, poinsettias, mattresses. I'm seeing more and more schools talk about doing mattress sales, and all family garage sales. So there's nothing wrong with any of these. So the thing it tends to be, though, they tend to be in most cases expensive in terms of high cost, high percentage of expense. but they also tend to be very low yield. And I'd say that from my perspective, the greater negatives is not so much the low dollar amount, but they're transactional. Especially if you're selling something as a transaction. And what you really want to do in all of your fundraising is have it, in one way or the other, donor centered. So every fundraiser you do, I believe, should either bring new donors into a financial relationship with the school, which is part of breaking out of the cycle of survival and moving towards sustainability. So either bring in new donors or cultivate the donors that you already have, so they have deeper stakeholder relationships. So there are some fundraisers, some of these small fundraisers, I think actually have real value. Grocery script, you never see it. It just adds up over time. Coupon books. We love coupon books because we use them. There's actual value in those coupon books. So it's not throwing everything under the bus. It's just saying that there are benefits and sort of pros and cons based on the types of things you do. Let me ask the question to you all that are watching this. For your school, to what degree is volunteer burnout an issue at your school? Or is it an issue? Are you doing lots of things that require volunteer time, not just fundraisers, but other activities? And are you finding that your volunteers are getting less and less enthusiastic about doing things around the school? Or are you finding that's not a problem? And I'll just say this statement, that volunteer burnout should always be something that a school administrator is trying to keep his or her finger on the pulse of, because it can be very, very dangerous. It can be very detrimental to your school culture. If you start burning people out, what tends to happen is your greatest leaders, and those that are most competent volunteer parents, tend to be the ones that do most of the volunteer activity. If you start burning them out, then not only are you burning them out now, but you're starting to actually lose some of your top leadership, and it's a very bad cycle. So mistakes. Why do a lot of schools make the mistake of doing low yield fundraisers? Well, number one, there's a real tendency to copy what other schools do. And that's just what we all do. We try to figure out, okay, what are you doing? Because most of us really don't know. We're going more and more to internet to try to get data, or we're talking to other schools. If you go to websites that you would think would be really helpful, like fundraising.com, check out fundraising.com. I think so many people, it's one of the top fundraising sites on the internet. And I think so many people, sincerely desperate for good ideas and help, go to this site, and you'll find close to 200 knickknacks that you can sell and all types of stuff that fall into what I would consider the transactional category, the low yield category. And so it's hard to find knowledge of what really works and what doesn't. So one is tendency to copy other schools. Two, just a lack of knowledge of some of the bigger fundraising options that are out there. Okay, talking about product sales, and this is, so mega trend number one that started about probably 12 to 15 years ago is what we looked at a few minutes ago about consolidation, getting from multiple small fundraisers and consolidating into typically 2 a year. There's also another trend that we've seen starting probably around early 2000s. And I've always thought this is a pendulum, because I think it's been a pendulum over the previous decades, where parents get to a point, they say, you know, we're done with this. Boy Scouts get to that point. We're done with selling popcorn and candy bars. And so they shift away from it for a few years, and then they come back. What we're seeing now is actually a trend that I think, it's a mega trend that I think is more permanent in nature. And the trend right now is an anti-product sale trend. It's a big concern of some of the largest product sale fundraising companies. Some of my friends are very involved in that industry and have told me how much fear there is as they're looking at trends and how they can shore up some of their declining sales. And I've always, until recently, attributed that just to the pendulum effect. You know, it's that parent pushback. But I think we have something much deeper going on right now, and it's the millennial culture. And when you look at your millennials, the millennials are technically kids from 12 years old to adults that are about 35. Most of your lower grade parents are millennials. Most of your middle and upper school students are millennials, and most of your staff are millennials. And there's some great things about millennials. I mean, millennials have some real positives. They get a lot of, bad press. One of their great positives is they love to be involved. Their giving dynamic is different. They don't give like older people give. They give smaller amounts of money, smaller percentages, but they're much more hands-on in projects, and they want to roll up their sleeves and get involved in things. And so I believe the trend we've seen away from product sales, a lot of that I believe is a millennial-driven negative reaction to product sales. And because of that, I believe that's going to be a continued trend. And that's, nobody knows, but that's just my perspective.
Well, but product sales are easy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so they're very time consuming, but they're easy. They're very tangible.
So speak to that. And I mean, why is it easy? And then where do you see a fit for products? Because this is not about bashing products. It's just putting information out.
Well, I definitely think that they're easier. I mean, like, well, you have the popsicles up here, and I definitely have had my share of selling the little lollipop things. And, you know, the kids get 100 lollipops. They sell 100. They bring you back $50. The problem is it's such a low yield, but sometimes it's just easier. Sometimes you have exhausted parents. This is something that can be ran more by the school office because it's not a real huge time sucker. Although just keeping it with the inventory, I think though some of the traps I've gotten into is all of a sudden there's 100 lollipops missing.
Excuse me, did you say time sucker? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Boy, I wish I'd done that on purpose. That would have been great.
Keep going.
I know in my case, many moons ago, we did the world's finest chocolate. And one of our volunteers left the chocolate in her car. I'm talking cases and cases and cases. And it's just a side story. And of course we live in Florida, right? So it didn't matter. It was November because it's still 100,000 degrees here. And all the chocolate bars melted. And the school had to eat all that profit. So there's definitely downsides to the product sales, low yield. You know, you're responsible for the product. But I've seen it work real well, especially like if the 8th grade wants to go on a trip and they just sell some lollipops, you know.
I do too.
Well.
And I would say there is definitely a legitimate role for product sales. It fits really well at some of the smaller level fundraisers. They are much easier in many cases. They're quick. So there is a very reasonable role. It's just looking at overall, if you're trying to raise larger amounts of money for greater school needs, just be aware of some of these dynamics and plan accordingly. And just for everybody that's viewing, we're right towards the end of the webinar here. So I'm just going to, for the sake of time, move on through a few more slides. And so in terms of the solution to the low yield mistake, number one, I know it sounds simplistic, but eliminate your low yield fundraisers, at least your school-wide fundraisers. Find better options that can raise more money, and especially options that are not transactional, but that are donor focused. So your goal is to always be looking at ways that you can bring new donors into the relationship with your school. And then, as we just mentioned a moment ago, reserve your product sale fundraisers for more small level or team level fundraising. And finally, fundraising mistake number 3, a lack of a long-term strategy or long-term master plan. And it's been my experience over the years in literally talking to hundreds and hundreds of, especially Christian schools, that I'd say definitely less than 10%, and I would guess probably around 7% or 8% only have a long-term 3 to 5 year master funding strategy or strategic funding plan. And I think it's one of the greatest reasons that you get caught in these cycles of survival. So the things that most of the schools we talk to, we see that there's no long-term funding plan. And this would be a write down for every school to make sure you work out at least a 3-year funding strategy. And that strategy will include what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. And I'll get into that in just a moment, another slide. But the things that we see so often with schools that we talk to is that there's no master funding plan. There's high stress that the administrators carry throughout the entire year. You know, laying awake at night, how in the world, it's not so much how are we going to meet the budget, but it's the implications. If we can't meet this budget, who am I going to let go? And how are we going to handle the classroom adjustments when we have to fire a teacher? And how's that going to affect her family? So there's high stress that is typically carried over this issue. We also see that most schools have no specific pipeline for bringing new donors into relationship, which again perpetuates this 12-month cycle for survival. And there's a principle in secular nonprofit fundraising that I think has real merit even in faith-based fundraising. That is that new donors are the lifeblood of every nonprofit. New donors are the lifeblood of every nonprofit. I would change that and say new donors are an essential source of revenue for your future sustainability as a school. And so it's really key that you focus on that new donor. So why do so many schools find themselves in this mistake of not having a master plan? Number one, I think there's just a lack of knowledge that there's a need for that. Number two, I think most of that issue tends to happen at the board level because you have board members that they may be experts in law or accounting or pastors or homemakers or teachers, but most of them I've seen don't really have an understanding of the need for a strategic plan or how to find out how you bake one. How do you make, what are the best practices? What do we need to have in a master plan? And there's just too much emphasis at the board level on the 12-month budget. You go through all this pain in establishing the budget for the next year and how are we going to fund this budget for the next year. And you tend to have blinders on. You tend to have, it's myopic. You're focusing just on the next 12 months. So in terms of solution, the solution is, I mean, pretty simplistic. Define a master plan, at least a 3-year master funding strategy. And so what would be some components of a 3-year to 5-year, but especially 3-year master funding plan? Number one is only do 2 major fundraisers per year, one in the fall, one in the late winter, early spring. And as you look at those fundraisers, look at those that have the capacity to raise $50,000 or more. And there are options out there that can do that. Number two, make sure that every fundraiser you do, the major fundraisers, are donor-centered. They're not transactional sales types of fundraisers. And number three, always share the pie with other entities in the school so you can build unity, but also so that you can engage your families because they have different hot buttons and you want everybody to feel like they're being served. So number one, only 2 major fundraisers per year. Number two, always center one of your fundraisers on a walkathon type of personal sponsorship fundraising process. That creates this pipeline of new donors. So if you convert all of your families into a true fundraiser, so they're going to their friend and family network all over the country saying, hey, would you sponsor me in this event, whatever this event is, for my school? Now you have all these new donors that are coming through the relationships of that family, and they're coming into your donor base. And we've seen schools that have done a good job on the follow-up be able to convert around 25% of those into ongoing school donors. So let's say that you have a 300 new donors that give to your walkathon. It could be Liftathon or Fun Run or whatever it is. If you convert 25% of those 300 new donors, you now have literally 75 new school donors that will be giving typically annually, in some cases even monthly. And now you're building up an entire revenue stream outside of your tuition stream. And then the third component that's really important in your plan, and this takes some real thinking through, is define your fundraising philosophy. Look at your culture, the core values, what you believe are important. If service is a big core value, like community service or community outreach, then look at things that involve your students in going out in the community and doing community service projects to benefit other people. So define your philosophy and look at the culture of your school. If you're a very affluent suburb school and you have lots of golfers, well, maybe golf should be part of that because that fits your culture. If you don't have that and you're more of a rural school, maybe sporting clays or fishing should be more relevant to your culture. And you make it relevant to your culture, now you're going to engage more families. Mm-hmm. But part of that is looking at, in your philosophy, based on your philosophy, what are the things we're going to do that we consider acceptable options? What are the things we say are not good fits or not acceptable options? So let me bring us down to the last slide here. And that is, we have 2 offers we'd love to make to you. Number one, getting from the very beginning, as I mentioned, our whole heart is to serve you. So we have lots of ideas. We'd love to share those ideas absolutely free. We're much more interested in sharing what we know that can benefit schools than we are trying to get people to hire us. So if you'd have any interest in a free consultation with Edna or myself, you'll see our phone number here, our website. You can contact us off the website or you can call us afterwards. And we'd be delighted to set up a call with you to talk with your whole board. So anything we can do to give you advice, we'd be delighted to. Secondly, one of the questions that Edna and I asked ourselves earlier was, knowing how busy all of you are and how strapped for time, how under-resourced most of you are, we asked the question of what can we do to do something fun that would also be somewhat of a give back, knowing that a lot of administrators are exhausted. They don't have a chance to get away much. So we have an offer if you're interested. And that is, if you want us to actually do a presentation with you and sit down and show you some of the specifics that we do, some of the major fundraising events we do. If you want to do that, we'd love to give you a thank you vacation. These are 3-day, 2-night vacations. There are 50 locations throughout the U.S. Sorry, Dina, we don't have Canadian options yet, but lots of really cool places like, Lake Tahoe, Hilton Head, Myrtle Beach, Gatlinburg, Orlando, Branson. But if you're interested in that, of course, we'd be delighted to tell you more about what we do. And I know we're right at almost at the 45-minute mark. We've got just a couple of minutes, maybe, if we want to take a few questions. You want to open
Absolutely.
up?
It's open.
Okay, so guys, anybody questions? I'm going to come back to where I can see you all better, and would love to field some questions you might have.
Don, you and I spoke about this the other day, but could you speak into really what is going to motivate corporate sponsorships when you're doing some of these events to kind of start that momentum when you first start an event to get those corporate sponsorships
Sure.
available?
And Kyle, I know I'll owe you a letter too, so I'll get that to you here, hopefully by the end of today.
Okay.
So corporate sponsors, that's a great question. That's actually a key part of your strategy to building out an additional revenue stream beyond tuition and beyond individual donors is starting to build out corporate partnerships in your community. And so you have to understand, why do companies give? Why do they sponsor events? And they give because they get. So in the range of, you've got corporate sponsors over here that tend to be anywhere from $500 to $2,500 level givers. Then you have underwriters, which is your higher level corporate sponsor that typically gives $5,000 or more. So for the underwriter that's giving $5,000 or more, they're giving because they have a heart for your mission. They're usually giving out of their business account, so they need to be able to legitimize their gift with recognition benefits. But over here, the corporate sponsor, your broad-based corporate sponsor, it's all about with them. What's in it for me? So the way you find them is you form a small team of key parents, board members and key parents who have sales personalities. They tend to be the business owner professional category that have relationships in the community. And you literally equip them to go do 3 or 4 sit-down, like 10-minute sit-down meetings with people they know that own businesses. And basically what they're presenting is an option. If you sponsor this event, it's easier to have them sponsor an event than it is just to sponsor the school. There's just something that feels better for most companies about being an event sponsor. But instead of saying things like, if you tell that potential sponsor, hey, for $500, we will put your name on the back of our t-shirt, we'll put you on our website, and we'll tell our parents all about you. That means nothing to a business person, because who's going to see that name? It's not tangible. But if you tell that business person, look, at the end of our event, we're going to take out an ad in this local family magazine, and we're going to take out another ad in this monthly social paper. The magazine goes to 32,000 people, and the social paper goes to 67,000 people. And we're going to thank you in front of almost 100,000 people for being a sponsor of our event. Now you're talking their language, because for $500, I'm going to be recognized in bona fide, measurable, legitimate areas in front of about 100,000 people.
Yeah.
So that's how you really do it. There's some other ways you can enhance that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. One more minute. Anybody else have another question? Okay, and once you ready, go ahead.
I've got a group of people who they do fundraisers because they've always done it. So, like we make $500 off one of the fundraisers, which is a real waste of, in my opinion, time. But they're doing it because people expect it. So how do you get them to realize that that's not like you can't satisfy everybody's needs?
That's actually a great question. So there's two facets I say. Number one is, if it's become a tradition of your school, it's been baked into your culture, so it's your annual fall festival and you do a pie auction at the end, well, that's okay. That's fun, and it's part of your culture. So there's benefits to cultural returns, if you will, ROI, return on investment. So if that's the case, maybe that just has a legitimate place and you just keep doing it. If you're looking for something that's much larger scale, and that $500 fundraiser is tapping out some people's volunteer times and discouraging them, then they need to have ownership. And what I would do is say, look, we have found some other options that I think can help take what we're already doing to a higher level, or some new ideas that can take what we're trying to do together to a higher level, I'd love for you to look at this with me, give me your feedback, and give them some ownership in that process. I think they'll be more supportive.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, Don, I think that's about all the time we have today. Guys,
Thank you.
this has been amazing. Thank you for hanging in there with us to the very end. I hope you learned a lot.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to be sending this out in a recording here as soon as I get it uploaded and do all the little fancy stuff I got to do to it. And you'll get a recording of this so you can share it with others as well.
Wonderful. Keep in mind, we'd be delighted to talk to you at any point. So I tell people we are a great free resource of great information. So call if you have any questions.
Thank you so much.